Former President Donald Trump spoke in Washington, D.C. for the first time since leaving office. What's his message and what's coming next? NTD's Iris Tao has more.
Taking the stage to a standing ovation at the America First Agenda Summit, former President Donald Trump is back here in Washington, D.C.
And Trump's visit here marks his first time back in the city since leaving office 18 months ago.
Trump begins by reflecting on the current state of the country.
But now our country has been brought to its knees.
And pivoting to the November elections.
This November, the people are going to vote to stop the destruction of our country, and they're going to vote to rescue America's future.
And that's before he spends 1/3 of his 90-minute speech on rising crime.
Our country is now a cesspool of crime. We have blood, death, and suffering on a scale once unthinkable.
He also cites a plan to restore public safety if Republicans win back the majority this fall, adding that he's confident that it'll continue under the next Republican president.
And when a Republican president takes back the White House in 2024, which I strongly believe will happen.
Trump also touches on open borders, transgender athletes and women's sports, and the 2020 election.
It was a catastrophe, that election, a disgrace to our country.
Trump did not say he's running for president in 2024, but he says he looks forward to laying out many more details in the weeks and months to come on what he calls an America First agenda. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
I spoke with Congressman Mike Johnson at the America First Agenda Summit about some key issues driving the country into the fall midterms, especially law and order. Here's our exchange. Congressman Mike Johnson, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
Congressman, the Democrats have received quite a bit of pushback over the defund the police movement that they've embraced. How big of an issue is law and order going to be going into the midterms?
I think it's a critical issue, whether you're talking about the border and the chaos that's ensued there, or the skyrocketing crime rate in America's largest cities and even in small communities now. It's a direct result of policy choices. You know, the Democrats went on record, the radical left, defund the police, disrespect the police. It's had the desired effect, I think, that some of them had in mind. And so the American people have had enough of it. It's a dangerous time. But the important thing and the important theme that we want to hammer home is that we can restore law and order. We must. It's an essential foundational principle of our country. And we look forward to rolling out our ideas and proposals on how to do that.
President Biden, before he got COVID, was supposed to roll out some funding for law enforcement, which is excellent. But money can only do so much. How do you restore the morale within the ranks of the police?
It's a great question. I know lots of first responders. I grew up in a first responder family. They are feeling demoralized. They're feeling as though they've been disrespected because they have been from the halls of power in the nation's capital. The message was sent repeatedly over and over that they were disliked and dishonored, and so it's had a real corrosive effect. And we've got to turn that around. We need to send a clarion call from the White House and both houses of Congress, and we'll do that with the Republicans in charge, that we stand with our first responders. We stand with law enforcement. They're doing a critical, important job to protect and serve, and they ought to be respected for that.
You touched upon it just now when it comes to the border. You know, we have law and order, but you also have the border crisis. What's it going to take to slow things down there?
Well, we need to do exactly the opposite of what President Biden and his administration have done. We questioned Secretary Mayorkas, DHS Secretary, in the House Judiciary Committee just a few months back, and I told him he needs to dust off his resume because I believe that what they've done is intentional. I believe that he is committing impeachable offenses by the day, and the results are just disastrous. It's impossible to overstate the magnitude of this crisis and what it's going to mean for our country in the months and years ahead. It's going to take a long time to unwind the damage, and they're just looking at it and blinking an eye and looking the other way, and it's preposterous. The people are fed up with it, and I think that's going to be a major cause of the big red wave in November.
What do you think is the logic behind their border policy?
Well, I know what the logic is. People in our town halls back in Louisiana want to know, why would they do this? Why would they erase the border, allow people from almost 190 countries just pour across with drugs and sex trafficking and all the terrible things that happen, why would they do it? The answer is very simple. They want to turn illegals into voters. They're already doing it in New York City and some large cities in blue states around the country. And I got Chairman Jerry Nadler of the House Judiciary Committee to admit to me on the record, on video, just a few weeks back, that yes, they would like to do across the country what they're doing in New York. And so that sounds like a conspiracy theory. It's not. It's a fact, and everybody can look that up for themselves.
And you mentioned a few of the atrocities that are taking place there, the fentanyl, the sex trafficking. What's it going to take for these types of things to really resonate with the American people?
Well, it is resonating loud and clear. I mean, drug overdoses is the #1 cause of death for Americans age 18 to 49 right now, more than car wrecks and cancer and COVID and everything else. And it's attributed in large part to this fentanyl, manufactured in China, sent to the drug cartels, and then flowing freely across our border because the Biden administration won't do anything about it. Our law enforcement are overwhelmed, our people are in jeopardy, and innocent Americans die every day because of these policy choices. That's just one aspect of the terrible tragedy that has become a catastrophe at the border.
Congressman Mike Johnson, thank you.
Thank you.
The White House is downplaying the possibility of a recession. A top economic official updated reporters as the administration prepares to counter the expected negative economic data that will be released after this week. NTD's Melina Wisecup is at the White House with the details.
The White House's director of the National Economic Council telling reporters today that job growth and consumer spending data debunk the argument that a recession is upon us. Let's listen.
We are seeing credit delinquencies and measures of credit stress at historic lows, credit card delinquencies at a 15-year low, mortgage delinquencies at a 30-year low. And we are seeing industrial output sustain and in positive territory 5 of the last 6 months. And so the totality of the economic data is consistent with that type of transition and is not consistent with a recession.
And he was pressed on how the American people can put faith in this positive economic outlook even after the White House had to admit later that it was wrong for calling inflation transitory, a question to which he responded, listing off a number of quotes from financial institutions like JP Morgan, who have explicitly said we're not in a recession. And adding to that, President Biden said just yesterday that he's not expecting a recession. And the National Bureau of Economic Research is the organization that usually deems whether or not the U.S. is in a recession. So far, they have not made that designation, but there are early signs that our economic growth is slowing. For example, for the first time in nearly 2 years, the U.S. business activity has contracted, and the number of people applying for unemployment benefits has been going up over the past couple of weeks. This leads many economists to believe that we could expect to see a recession early next year. Now, we will have more insight into this once those GDP numbers come out later this week, and the Federal Reserve is expected to meet tomorrow to raise interest rates once again in a bid to handle this record high inflation. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Wisecup, NTD News.
Socialism is a stepping stone to communism. And nearly 50% of young people ages 16 to 23 now say that they favor a socialist society. 24-year-old Caroline Levitt is hoping to change that. Levitt worked under former White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany and is now bidding to be the youngest member of Congress. At this year's Turning Point USA Summit, NTD's Melina Wisecup sat down with Levitt.
All right, we're here with Caroline Levitt, who is a congressional candidate for New Hampshire's 1st District, and she's also the former Assistant Press Secretary for the White House under Kayleigh McEnany. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me today.
Yes, it's great to hear from you. So you are a very young person. You're 24 years old, but you're very ambitious running for Congress. You said something in one of your previous interviews that you want to go to D.C. and shake up the system. Mm-hmm. What does that look like?
That looks like electing young, especially conservative candidates to office. The average age of Congress right now is over 60 years old. I worked there. I worked in the White House, as you said, for President Trump. I also worked on Capitol Hill for Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. And I was always struck by the fact that I was always the youngest person in the room by several years. I mean, decades. So there's people in Washington on both sides of the aisle right now that have literally been down there longer than I have been alive, clinging to power. Our government needs to be shaken up. We need to ensure that it's as our founding fathers originally intended, by public servants who want to go down there, do the people's work, and then return home. That's why I'm a strong believer in term limits, and we need to start speaking out against the system that is so incredibly corrupt, paying for committee assignments, passing 1,000-page bills that no lawmaker is reading. Yep. There are a lot of mechanisms that we need to enforce in Congress today to make sure we are shaking up the system, but it begins by electing young conservatives like myself to begin doing that and speaking out.
I wanted to ask you about young people seeing through the deception of socialism and communism, because nowadays, I mean, our colleges indoctrinate students with this ideology. How can young people kind of break through that? I mean, if they're not here, if they're not born in a conservative family, if they're just being fed this indoctrination, I mean, how can people just help them to see through that deception?
So this is something I talk about every single day on the campaign trail in New Hampshire, whether I'm speaking to a crowd of older folks or speaking to young people. I've made a strong commitment as a young conservative to go to college campuses, to meet these young people where they are. And I cannot blame them. I've found throughout this journey of campaigning for a year, I cannot blame them for being indoctrinated, because they are hearing Marxism and socialism from every single facet of their lives. It begins in our public school system, as we've woken up to the past few years throughout COVID-19. It is forced even more so in the higher education system. It's on social media, as you mentioned, big tech, Hollywood, our entire culture. You watch any award show on primetime television, they're slamming Donald Trump. They're talking about socialism and Marxism. However, there has never been a more opportune time now with this administration to talk to these voters, to bring them on our side, because they are feeling the very real and tangible consequences of this socialist agenda in DC right now, with inflation at highest it's ever been in our lifetimes, right? Gas prices higher than they've ever been in our lifetime. Rent skyrocketing in cities across America. The American dream for our generation is completely unattainable and unaffordable. As a young person, I'm experiencing it myself. I'm not afraid to say, even though I'm a candidate, I can't afford to purchase a home in this market. I'm stuck in the rental rabbit hole like a lot of Gen Zers are. These are very real issues that our generation is feeling. We just need to bridge that gap and explain to them why they are occurring.
Very good points there. And you just mentioned all of those tangible issues that we just talked about prior to this conversation, prior to this interview. You can see the impacts of inflation, gas prices, things like this. But one other issue that we've spoken about in the past is, social media's influence. And we know, for example, TikTok has become very popular. And some people would say that it's even a type of psychological warfare that the Chinese Communist Party is using to kind of dumb down Americans. And then it goes to the fact of, also intertwined with our education system, young people aren't being taught to critically think about issues, and social media platforms like TikTok are contributing to that.
Right.
What is your comments on that?
Right. So social media and the one state corporate media, which CNN, MSNBC, Washington Post, New York Times, I fought against them in the front lines in President Trump's White House press office. The whole media conglomerate in America today is probably the biggest issue that we face, because they are brainwashing half of our country. They're directly targeting young Americans, and they know that it's working, especially on TikTok. You brought that up. It's the issue of my generation's time. Overwhelmingly, Generation Z Americans are using it. Not only so, they're using it as their main source of news. I mean, think about that, right? They're not reading even the Washington Post or the New York, right? They're not reading newspapers. They are going on TikTok for their information that is controlled and monitored by the Chinese Communist Party. So they're stealing our intellectual property, they're manipulating algorithms to brainwash young people, and they are forcing very divisive and disgusting ideologies on the minds of our youth. In terms of the transgender push that we've seen, that's all coming straight from the CCP. Young people, though, don't realize that. If they did, they might not be on this app, because they're not feeling the consequences of the indoctrination. It's not hitting their pocketbook. It's not hitting their wallet. Even young people vote with their wallets, right? It's a powerful force. So how do we relay that? Again, it goes back to electing young people and taking very clear, tangible legislative action when we do take back the House. We have to bust up big tech. We have to repeal Section 230. And as President Trump sought to do, we must find a solution to ban TikTok from the United States of America. The war against China will never be boots on the ground. It's going to be from the inside out, and they're already winning it. So we have to take very strong action to ensure that they can't anymore.
What gives you the energy? I mean, you could get discouraged in this day and age, seeing so many things around you, just these kids being indoctrinated, things not, Democrats taking both chambers of Congress, the White House, policies headed in the wrong direction. What gives you that sense of hope and the motivation to move forward?
Well, I'm certainly led by my faith in God and my belief in a higher purpose, which is something that we're really lacking amongst young people too, is faith in God. It drives me every single day. I believe this is God's plan in my life for me to run for Congress at this moment in time. As my boss, Kaylee, titled her book, For Such a Time as This. I believe this was God's plan for me at this moment in time when we're seeing the indoctrination of my generation, when we're seeing this socialist takeover of our country, the weaponization of all of these institutions. It's a very scary and fearful time. So I'm driven by my faith in God, my family, who is incredibly supportive, and I'm grateful for them every day. And then the support of the people of New Hampshire.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
Thank you.
A group of Republican lawmakers is probing why federal funds are being granted to U.S. universities with ties to the Chinese Communist regime. Republican Congressman Jim Banks and 56 of his GOP colleagues sent a letter to Department of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin asking for an explanation. The letter states that the DoD has awarded funding to universities that also host Beijing-funded Confucius Institutes. These institutes have served as China's overseas propaganda setup. Though many Confucius Institutes have been rebranded under a different name, they continue to function similarly. The GOP lawmakers noted that federal grants are banned from going to any academic institution that hosts a Confucius Institute. The lawmakers provided Austin a list of questions over the rebranded Confucius Institutes, setting a deadline of August 15th. Congressional lawmakers are being given $10,000 to buy security equipment for their homes. The new residential security program is being spearheaded by the House Sergeant at Arms to protect members of the House of Representatives and their families. Threats and attempted attacks against lawmakers are raising concerns. Last week, Representative Lee Zeldin was attacked while giving a speech. Lawmakers also face continual threats that some fear could escalate into violence.